I never thought I would be the woman who looked forward to seeing another man more than her own husband. I never imagined feeling my heart race at the sound of a notification on my phone, hoping it was from him. I never expected to lie in bed at night, thinking not of the man sleeping beside me, but of someone else entirely. Yet here I am, sharing a story that I still haven't fully processed myself. My name is Laura, and for 10 years I believed I had a perfect marriage. James and I met in college, fell deeply in love, and built what I thought was an unshakable foundation. We had our dream home in the suburbs, successful careers, and a comfortable routine that felt safe. But somewhere along the way, that safety began to feel more like monotony, and the comfort more like emotional disconnection. The change was so gradual that I barely noticed it happening. First, it was just James working later at the office. Then it was the shorter conversations over dinner, the less frequent moments of affection, the way his eyes would remain glued to his phone even when I was speaking. I told myself it was normal, that all marriages go through phases, that the passion would return if I just waited long enough. But waiting didn't change anything. If anything, the distance between us grew wider with each passing month. I started to feel invisible in my own home, like a housekeeper rather than a wife. James would come home, eat the dinner I'd prepared, mumble a thank you, and retreat to his study, or the television. I couldn't remember the last time he had really looked at me, or asked how my day was with genuine interest. It wasn't that James was a bad husband. He wasn't. He provided well, never forgot birthdays or anniversaries, and was, by all societal standards, a good man. But emotional intimacy had disappeared from our relationship, and I felt its absence like a physical ache. By our 8th anniversary, I had gained 20 pounds and lost most of my self-confidence. I looked in the mirror, and barely recognized the woman staring back at me, not just physically, but in the dull emptiness I saw in my eyes. That's when I decided something needed to change. I couldn't fix my marriage alone, but I could at least try to feel like myself again. I joined a gym. It wasn't a dramatic decision, it was just something I felt I needed to do for myself. I didn't tell James right away, not because I was hiding it, but because I didn't think he'd notice the difference in my schedule. When I finally mentioned it casually over breakfast, he glanced up from his phone with mild surprise. "That's great," he said, before his eyes drifted back to his screen. "Let me know if it costs extra." That was it. No questions about what had inspired me, no offer to join me, or support my efforts, just a practical concern about money. I shouldn't have been disappointed. It was exactly what I'd expected, but somehow, hearing his indifference out loud, hurt more than I anticipated. The gym was intimidating at first. I hadn't exercised regularly in years, and I felt self-conscious among the fit, confident people who seemed to know exactly what they were doing. I stuck to the treadmill for the first few sessions, too nervous to try anything else. That's when the gym manager approached me about personal training sessions. "Just a consultation to start," she said warmly. "No pressure, but it might help you feel more comfortable here." I agreed mostly out of politeness, not expecting much. The next day I met Mark. Mark wasn't what I expected a personal trainer to be. He wasn't intimidatingly muscular, or aggressively motivating. He was fit, yes, but in a natural, approachable way. He had kind eyes and an easy smile that immediately put me at ease. When he asked me about my fitness goals, he actually listened to my answer, nodding thoughtfully. "It's not really about weight loss," I admitted, surprising myself with my honesty. I want to feel stronger, more like myself." He didn't laugh or dismiss my words as I half expected. Instead, he nodded, as if what I'd said made perfect sense. "Strength isn't just physical," he said. "Sometimes the strongest thing we can do is decide to make a change." It was such a simple statement, but something about the way he said it, with genuine understanding, made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. I signed up for twice-weekly sessions without hesitation. Training with Mark quickly became the highlight of my week. He challenged me but never pushed me beyond my limits. He celebrated my small victories as if they were major achievements, and most importantly, he talked to me, really talked to me, during our sessions. We didn't just discuss fitness, we talked about books, movies, our backgrounds, our philosophies on life. It felt so natural, so easy, in a way that conversations with James hadn't in years. The physical changes came gradually, more energy, more strength, more confidence in how I carried myself. But the emotional changes were more immediate and more profound. I started looking forward to my days, planning my outfits with more care, feeling a spark of life that had been dormant for too long. I didn't realize how deep the connection with Mark had become until the day he had to cancel a session due to illness. The disappointment I felt was disproportionate, almost crushing. I found myself checking my phone throughout the day, hoping he might feel better and change his mind. That night, I lay in bed next to James and realized with a jolt of guilt that I was more upset about missing a training session than I was about the emotional distance from my husband. I tried to rationalize it. Mark was my friend, I told myself. It was natural to enjoy spending time with a friend who made me feel good about myself. There was nothing inappropriate about our relationship. We never discussed anything too personal, never touched beyond the necessary adjustments during exercises. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. I knew that the flutter in my stomach when he texted wasn't just friendly excitement. The training sessions continued, and so did our deepening connection. Mark began texting me occasionally, outside of our sessions, a healthy recipe he thought I might like, an article related to something we discussed, a simple check-in about how my week was going. Each message made my heart race, and each response I crafted was carefully considered, as if I was writing something far more significant than casual texts. After a particularly challenging session, where I'd pushed past what I thought were my limits, Mark looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before, a mixture of pride and something else I couldn't quite name. "You're amazing, Laura," he said softly. "I hope you know that." It wasn't a grand declaration, but the way he said it, with such sincerity, such focus, made me feel as if I was the only person in the world who mattered in that moment. I felt myself blush, and for a heartbeat, neither of us spoke. Something unspoken passed between us, something that both thrilled and terrified me. I went home that day, feeling both elated and guilty. I tried to engage James in conversation over dinner, hoping to recreate even a fraction of the connection I felt with Mark. But James was distracted as usual, responding with monosyllables, until he eventually excused himself to take a work call. I sat alone at the table, the contrast between my two relationships stark and painful. That night, Mark texted me, "You did great today, proud of you." A simple message, the kind he'd sent before. But this time, as I read it in the darkness of my bedroom, with James snoring beside me, I felt a surge of emotions that I couldn't ignore. I was falling for my trainer, and I didn't know what to do about it. I considered stopping the sessions. That would be the sensible thing to do, the right thing. But the thought of not seeing Mark anymore created a hollowness in my chest that I couldn't bear. Instead, I told myself I would be more careful, maintain better boundaries, remember my commitment to James. But intentions are easier than actions. The next few weeks became a careful dance of moments that lingered too long, glances that said too much, texts that became more personal, more frequent. We never crossed a physical line, but emotionally, I was already somewhere I shouldn't have been. James, meanwhile, had started to notice the changes in me. Not the emotional affair, I was too careful for that, but the new confidence, the way I smiled more, the fact that I no longer seemed to crave his attention, the way I once had. "You're different lately," he said one evening, looking up from his laptop with narrowed eyes. I tensed. "Different how?" He shrugged. "I don't know, just different. Is it the gym? You seem obsessed with that place." There was an edge to his voice that I hadn't heard before. Jealousy, perhaps, or just discomfort at a change he hadn't initiated or controlled. For a moment, I considered telling him everything, how lonely I'd been, how disconnected we'd become, how I'd found in Mark the emotional intimacy I'd been missing. But I couldn't form the words. Instead, I just nodded. "I guess it's given me something for myself," I said carefully. "It feels good to focus on my own goals for once." He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "That's good, I suppose." But I could tell he didn't think it was good at all. For the first time in a long time, James began to pay more attention to me. He started asking about my day, suggesting we go out for dinner occasionally, even bringing home flowers one evening. Under different circumstances, I might have been overjoyed at this renewed interest. Instead, I felt a confusing mix of emotions. Appreciation, yes, but also a sinking realization that his efforts felt too late. The crisis point came on a rainy Tuesday. I had a session with Mark scheduled, but James unexpectedly came home early, complaining of a headache. He rarely took time off work, and the coincidence felt too deliberate to ignore. "Maybe you should skip the gym today," he suggested, settling onto the couch. We could watch a movie together, like we used to. The offer was tempting, a glimpse of the connection I'd been missing for so long, but the thought of canceling on Mark made my stomach twist. I told James I couldn't skip. I'd already paid for the session, and Mark was expecting me. The look on James's face was a mixture of hurt and suspicion that made my guilt flare painfully. But I went anyway, telling myself it was just a training session, that I wasn't doing anything wrong. When I arrived at the gym, Mark immediately sensed something was off. "Everything okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Just some tension at home. Let's focus on the workout." But my concentration was scattered, and halfway through the session, I missed a step and twisted my ankle. It wasn't a serious injury, but the pain brought tears to my eyes. Tears that were more about my emotional turmoil than physical discomfort. Mark was instantly beside me, his hand on my shoulder, his eyes filled with worry. "Laura," he said softly, "talk to me, what's really going on?" And just like that, the dam broke. The words poured out of me. My fading marriage, my loneliness, my confusion about my feelings for him. I told him things I hadn't even fully admitted to myself. And he listened, really listened. His hand is still warm on my shoulder, his eyes never leaving mine. When I finally stopped talking, there was a heavy pause. Then Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'd be lying if I said I didn't care about you," he admitted quietly. "More than I should, but I never wanted to complicate your life. The acknowledgement of mutual feelings should have made me happy. Instead, it made the situation painfully real. We weren't just friends. This wasn't just a harmless connection. We were standing on the edge of something that could destroy the life I had built." "I don't know what to do," I whispered. Mark looked at me for a long moment. "I think you do," he said gently. "I think you need to decide what you really want, not just for today, but for your future." He helped me ice my ankle, called me a ride share, and maintained a respectful distance as we said goodbye. But as I sat in the back of the car, watching his figure grow smaller in the distance, I knew he was right. I needed to make a decision. When I got home, James was waiting, his face tight with worry, and something that looked like resignation. Before I could speak, he held up my phone, which I'd accidentally left behind in my rush to leave. "Mark texted," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Looking forward to seeing you today. Our sessions are the highlight of my week." My heart sank. The text wasn't inappropriate, but the sentiment behind it was clear enough. "James," I began, but he shook his head. "Just tell me the truth, Laura. Is there something going on?" I could have lied. I could have said Mark was just a motivating trainer who took pride in his clients' progress. But I was tired of the half-truths, the emotional distance, the pretending. "Not physically," I said quietly, "but emotionally. Yes, I've formed a connection with him that I shouldn't have." James closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing a blow. When he opened them, they were filled with a mixture of hurt and resignation. "Why?" he asked simply. It was a loaded question, one I could have answered in a dozen different ways, but I chose the most honest one. "Because he sees me, he listens to me, he makes me feel like I matter." James's face crumpled. "And I don't." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "Not for a long time." The conversation that followed was the most honest one we'd had in years. James admitted his own emotional withdrawal, his focus on work at the expense of our relationship, his assumption that stability was enough. I admitted my loneliness, my failure to communicate my needs clearly, my allowing another man to fill the void James had left. We talked through the night, sometimes in tears, sometimes in anger, sometimes in resigned silence. By the time the sun came up, we were exhausted but clearer about where we stood than we had been in years. "So what now?" James asked, his voice hoarse. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not just the distracted husband of recent years, but the man I had fallen in love with, the man who was finally showing vulnerability and a willingness to change. "I don't know," I answered honestly, "but I think we owe it to ourselves, to what we've built, to try." That morning, I sent Mark a message, explaining that I wouldn't be continuing our training sessions. I told him the truth, that my feelings for him were real, but that I had decided to try to repair my marriage. His response was gracious and understanding, which somehow made the decision both easier and more painful. In the weeks that followed, James and I began the slow, difficult work of rebuilding our connection. We started counseling, began having regular date nights, and made conscious efforts to truly engage with each other. It wasn't easy. And there were days when I still thought about Mark, still wondered what might have been. But gradually, the pull began to lessen as James and I rediscovered each other. 6 months later, I returned to the gym for the first time since that rainy day. Mark was no longer working there. He had moved to another facility across town. Part of me was relieved, but another part felt a pang of loss for a connection that had awakened me to what I truly needed in my life. As I worked out alone, I reflected on how close I had come to crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I had stood at the edge of infidelity, pulled back by a combination of circumstance and choice. I wasn't proud of the emotional affair, but I couldn't regret the wake-up call it had provided. My marriage isn't perfect now. James and I still have our struggles, our moments of disconnect, but we're both present now, both committed to seeing each other, to nurturing what we almost lost. And I've learned that sometimes, it takes almost losing something to understand its true value. If there's one thing I've taken from this experience, it's that emotional affairs can be just as dangerous as physical ones, perhaps even more so, because they're easier to justify, easier to hide, even from ourselves. The intimacy of truly being seen by another person is powerful, almost addictive when you've been emotionally starved. I don't judge anyone who has found themselves in a similar situation. I understand now how easily it can happen, how a harmless connection can grow into something that threatens everything you've built. All I can say is that the choices we make in those moments define not just our relationships, but who we are and who we want to be.